Welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, August 17th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the United States Senate election in the state of Michigan and the 2026 race that is shaping up to be far more competitive than it otherwise should be in a Democratic wave year that is expected to be the 2026 midterm elections. Now, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the Democratic Party's pathway to a Senate majority, and a lot of it hinges on Democrats maintaining control in the states that they currently have control of. Democrats right now maintain about 47 seats in the United States Senate, including the state of Michigan, which we've been looking to as a state. The Democrats are again going to have to rely on if they want any chance of winning Senate control, not even in 2026, but even in the 2028 election. But the last presidential election, Donald Trump won the state of Michigan by a margin here of roughly 1.4%, a pretty substantive margin, larger than his margin of victory in Michigan in the 2016 election, but roughly about a point less than where we saw President Biden win that election in 2020. Thinking about the 2026 race, Michigan is often one that we overlook simply because it is a state that if everything goes to plan, or at least 75% of the way there, Michigan should be a state the Democrats will win in the 2026 race. But what we know in American politics is that nothing is guaranteed. On the Republican side, it's a pretty clear-cut race. Mike Rogers, the U.S. representative from Michigan's 8th District, he had served in Congress for over a decade before leaving office in the 2014 midterm elections. Then he decided that he was going to return to run for Congress, this time for Senate, in 2024 against Elissa Slotkin, who ended up winning that race by a margin of just under half a percentage point in a contested Republican and Democratic Senate election in 2024. So despite Donald Trump winning it on the presidential level, Michigan actually voted to the left. Elissa Slotkin outpaced Kamala Harris and many other Democrats across the state and won in her Senate race, ushering in yet again another Democratic senator from the state of Michigan. When surrounding states like Pennsylvania flipped to the Republican Party and Ohio, Michigan stayed blue. But the 2026 race is a bit trickier. Mike Rogers having a clear primary means that the Republicans already know who their candidate is going to be. He's endorsed by Donald Trump, endorsed by a wide range of Senate Republicans, and people look to him as the future for the Michigan GOP. After all, it did take two times for Dave McCormick to get elected to the U.S. Senate from the state of Pennsylvania, and they were back-to-back elections. Lost the first one, went on to win the next. But looking at the Democratic side, there actually isn't a clear-cut frontrunner on the Democratic side for a variety of different reasons. Haley Stevens right now stands to be the quote-unquote frontrunner in the state of Michigan, but she's by no means the strongest candidate to many people's looking at this race. Now, Haley Stevens, again, could be, but we don't know. There's a lot that's out there, but a lot of criticism towards the Democratic Party in this race is that they say that Haley Stevens will lose the election. But there doesn't seem to be a consensus if really any of these Democrats are the strongest candidates. You have candidates that are, or Democrats who are closer to the center that say, actually, you're wrong. Haley Stevens is the most electable candidate. You have candidates that are a bit in the middle as well, but a little bit more on the left that say you're all wrong. Mallory McMorrow is the strongest candidate. You have members on the further left who say you are all wrong too. Abdullah Saeed is the strongest candidate in this race. There are a lot of people who have a lot of opinions in this race, with candidates who are roughly raising the same amount of money, who are arguably competing in similar categories and similar territory in the state of Michigan. And because there are no true and clear-cut regional advantages really for the majority of these candidates, there doesn't seem to be a clear frontrunner. It's not as if that what we see in the primary in Michigan is dictated from the very top to the very bottom on the mitten here. You're talking about across the state, often the vote share is pretty proportional regardless of what region of the state you are in. We've seen it in time and time again. The Democratic primaries, again, even if they are contested, very much seem like landslides on a county map because that regional advantage doesn't exist to the same degree that it does in other states. But that's not to say that Haley Stevens, for instance, would do worse in an 11th district than an 8th district because she represents the 11th district. Chances are she'll do better. The problem here for a lot of the Democrats is because there is no clear frontrunner, there is no clear direction at which the state party wants to go in. But I think the bigger issue here isn't that there isn't a clear frontrunner. Primaries are meant to be competitive, and they don't have to be this clear-cut, especially given that the national environment is likely already to favor Democrats. The bigger problem here has to do with the race that has nearly nothing to do with the Senate election and entirely to do with the state boundaries of Michigan being the gubernatorial race. Now, this Michigan governor's race is one that is going to be for the history books, and maybe not for the best reasons for the Democratic Party. The reason for that is because former Democratic mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan, popular guy, current mayor right now, had been elected twice, is running in the 2026 governor's race as an independent, not as a Democrat, like the political party that he was part of for a very long time, up until the end of last year. Decided now that he wants to run as an independent. Now, he's raised about $3 million across the state. Roughly, a good amount, but significantly more than what many others have even tried to raise at this point. Well, not necessarily. Jocelyn Benson has raised equal amounts, but thinking about the other candidates here, including the lieutenant governor, has not raised the same amount. And it's going to be a very contested Democratic primary as well, where you have the lieutenant governor running against the Michigan Secretary of State. And what problem here arises is the fact that all of these candidates are in a contested primary. Jocelyn Benson will likely win this Democratic primary, but a contested general that certainly is breaking in a three-way race. Benson wins with 35 to 34 to 22. It's clear that in a state that is about 50-50 Dem-Republican, Mike Duggan doesn't just pull from Democrats, but also pulls from Republicans too, but is weighing down Democrats in a way that is not advantageous and certainly not helpful. Because what we know is that Mike Duggan, as an independent, sure, pulls away. But he's a factor here that by the eventual election day could end up benefiting the Republican Party more than the Democratic Party if it is those Detroit Democrats that are flocking to Mike Duggan, and some Republicans that by the time you reach election, people often lock in and end up supporting the candidate that they are more inclined to, which as the race emerges, more and more is a two-way race, and as these debates become more and more of a Dem versus Republican rather than Dem versus Republican versus independent Mike Duggan conversation, it will look more and more like that Republicans win this race. And thinking, too, about the impact of this on the Senate election, we have to go back to the 2018 midterm elections. Not this, but this one. 2018, Democrats, this is not even 2018. I don't know where I'm throwing us all for a loop here. 2018, we go back to that House race. In Michigan, you would think, okay, pretty contested. But here's the thing. Democrats won the governorship by a massive amount. Even though it was 7-7 in the House delegation, Gretchen Whitmer defeated Bill Schuette, who at this time was running on the Republican ticket as a state elected official, and not to mention it wasn't even particularly close. Gretchen Whitmer won by roughly 10 points across the state. A pretty massive advantage, and one that did trickle down to the Senate races in Michigan to take that race to a 7-point margin, which 6 years later ended up voting for Slotkin by less than half a point. The circumstances of statewide races often do impact one another. If Democrats already are at a point where the 2026 race has no clear direction and the 2026 governor's race is looking very similar, it makes it difficult for Democrats to navigate a slam dunk victory in either of the two races. Republicans have a strong candidate. Mike Rogers is not particularly weak. Elissa Slotkin just was particularly strong in this Senate election, which is why she won. But there is no reality at which Mike Rogers blows this race. The competitiveness of the election largely does depend on the Democratic nominee. And what we are finding is that the numbers say that Stevens is up, but we don't know, and we don't have any real high-quality polls out of the state that we haven't seen in a while, and the only most recent one from June is a Dem internal, and we're not going to use that as a point of reference here. I want to see some real Emerson style or Emerson quality, something like that, polling in the state to make a better indication and better assessment. But as of now, again, Democrats in Michigan are largely left without clear direction and a clear directive as to what they need and want in this state. And that's why I think Democrats can look at this and say, this is one of the few races that if you go back to 2018, the last time there was a Democratic wave, the expectations of this race were either likely or safe for the Democratic Party. And today, they're a toss-up. Even going back to the 2024 election, thinking about that cycle and thinking about the regular election, toss-up by one, but lean or likely by everybody else. Looking at 2026 doesn't seem as great for the Democratic Party. And so while we do talk, and arguably rightfully so, about the fact that Maine is in reach for Democrats, North Carolina is in reach for Democrats, the Democrats might make a play for Alaska, that Ohio might be in reach for Democrats. We forget the biggest piece of the puzzle isn't just winning red states, but it's maintaining blue ones. And it's holding on to seats when the odds don't seem like they're aligning in a way that was as good for Democrats as the 2018 midterm elections, even if the national environment feels that way. Because if Democrats are not turning out for the governor level, they probably aren't turning out for the Senate level either. And because there, again, is no clear direction for which way the primary wants to go, this competitive primary versus an uncontested, steamrolled GOP one could end up being damaging for the eventual Democratic candidate and might make it so a less electable candidate emerges. We've seen it happen before. After all, Ron DeSantis wouldn't be governor if that Florida primary might have gone differently. Now, that's all speculation, and that's not a guarantee. And obviously, making these arguments is something that I'm not going to say makes sense to say are 100% grounded in what we're looking at. Yes, you can look at hypothetical polling data, and yes, you can look at all of these different metrics and say X candidate would have been stronger than the other. But if something doesn't work for a political party, chances are trying something else might have been better. And so I think the thing about Michigan here is that it's so wonky. It's so up in the air. There is no clear direction. Again, I want to reiterate that because that is what the biggest problem here is for a lot of the Democrats, which is that they feel they are losing without a candidate that is taking to the main stage. And a lot of these candidates have had a lot of name ID and a lot of, notability across the state. They've been campaigning for months on end in Michigan, and yet the data really isn't budging. But what we know, and what is the truest fact of it all, is that Michigan is a toss-up. Democrats, I believe, will likely win the Senate race with any of their candidates if the circumstances of the national environment are beneficial enough. Because that's how Dave McCormick beat Bob Casey in 2024. But there is no guarantee of that. And thinking about the Michigan governor's race that coincides with this Senate race, it's yet again another hurdle that Democrats have to cross in a state that maybe they shouldn't have so many hurdles. This should be one of the states that Democrats can rely on. And as of right now, I don't know if I would use the word rely or the ability for Democrats to rely on it. It will be competitive, and Democrats right now start as the favorites. But it stands to be a race that could pose a problem for Democrats later down the line, and almost nobody is talking about it for 2026, but almost everybody should be paying attention to it because it matters, and it matters a lot. And even if Democrats run up the map and they lose Michigan, there goes the Senate majority, not just in 26, but also in 2028. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.